With 3 cleaning jobs and medical bills that never seemed to shrink, Keisha Williams was running out of time and money until a mysterious Korean businessman offered her a position that paid 3 times her salary, but came with one strange rule: never touch him. At 24, Keisha balanced industrial-strength cleaning supplies and nursing school textbooks with the kind of exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. She was practical, focused, and knew exactly what $50,000 in student loan debt felt like pressing down on her chest every morning at 5 a.m. Her natural hair, carefully protected under a silk scarf during her early morning hotel shift, framed a face that radiated quiet determination even when her body screamed for rest. She was driven by an uncompromising vision, a stethoscope around her neck, a life saving others, and a world where her grandmother could receive dialysis without Keisha counting every dollar. The Millennium Hotel's marble lobby gleamed under crystal chandeliers as Keisha pushed her cleaning cart through corridors that cost more per square foot than her apartment's monthly rent. Her first job started at 5 a.m., cleaning luxury suites for guests who spent more on one night than she earned in a week. By noon, she would rush to her second job cleaning office buildings downtown. By evening, she would collapse into her third job cleaning a small medical practice, studying between patients when the doctors allowed it. 3 jobs, 18-hour days, 7 days a week, and she was still drowning. Her phone buzzed with the text message that would change everything. Mrs. Chun, the elderly cleaning supervisor who had become something like a mentor, had forwarded a job posting that seemed too good to be true. Private residence, Gangnam District, live-in position available, salary $300,000 annually plus benefits. Keisha stared at the numbers, certain there was a mistake. That was more money than she had ever imagined making, enough to pay off her loans, cover her grandmother's medical expenses, and actually finish nursing school without working herself to death. The interview address led her to one of Seoul's most exclusive residential towers, the kind with a doorman in white gloves, private elevator access, and security that looked military-grade. Keisha stood in the marble lobby, taking in the understated wealth that permeated every surface, feeling completely out of place in her clean but obviously budget work clothes. The elevator rose silently to the 42nd floor, stopping at a private penthouse that occupied the entire top level. The door opened to reveal a space that defied comprehension. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seoul stretching to the horizon. The interior was a study in minimalist luxury, all clean lines and expensive materials, marble floors that reflected the afternoon light, custom furniture that looked like modern art, and a sense of cold perfection that felt more like a museum than a home. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the whisper of climate control and the distant hum of the city below. He stood near the windows with his back to the door, a figure of controlled intensity that seemed to command the vast space around him. Korean, late 30s, dressed in a dark suit that was so perfectly tailored it seemed molded to his frame rather than merely worn. When he turned to acknowledge her arrival, Keisha found herself looking into sharp features that were almost sculpted in their precision, dark hair swept back without a strand out of place, and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance in the span of a heartbeat. Park Jin-hwan moved with deliberate precision, each gesture measured and controlled, maintaining a careful distance that felt both natural and oddly formal. His presence filled the enormous penthouse in a way that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with an intensity that seemed barely contained beneath his immaculate exterior. There was something almost untouchable about him, a quality that suggested he existed in a different realm entirely from ordinary human interaction. The previous housekeeper's warnings echoed in Keisha's mind as she observed him from across the room. Mrs. Chun had been unusually serious when explaining why the position was vacant. "He doesn't let anyone within 3 feet," she had said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The last girl tried to dust his desk while he was sitting there. Fired immediately. No explanation. Just gone. The pay is extraordinary, but the rules are absolute." "Mr. Park," Keisha said, her voice steady despite the intimidating grandeur of the situation. "Miss Williams," he replied, his English perfect and precise, carrying the faintest accent that somehow made every word sound more important. "Please, remain where you are." The interview was conducted across the vast living room. neither of them moving closer to the other. He explained the position with the same precision he seemed to apply to everything else. The penthouse required daily maintenance, complete discretion, and absolute adherence to specific protocols. The salary was indeed $300,000 annually, plus full medical benefits, plus a housing allowance that would more than cover her grandmother's medical expenses. Keisha found herself studying his face as he spoke, noting the way he held himself with rigid control, the careful distance he maintained, the way his hands never quite settled anywhere. There was something almost fragile beneath the intimidating exterior, a quality that her nursing training recognized as someone carrying invisible wounds. The medical equipment she glimpsed through an open doorway suggested he had health concerns, but everything about his bearing suggested he managed them alone. "Your grandmother requires dialysis," he said, the statement delivered as a fact rather than a question. "Yes, sir," Keisha replied, wondering how he could possibly know that detail. "The position includes comprehensive medical coverage for immediate family members," he continued, his dark eyes studying her reaction. "You would live here, available for household management 24 hours daily. Your nursing education would be completed through arrangement with Seoul National University's accelerated program." Keisha felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the scope of what he was offering became clear. This wasn't just a job, it was salvation. Complete financial security, her grandmother's medical needs covered, her education completed through one of Asia's most prestigious universities. It was everything she had been working toward, handed to her by a stranger who seemed to exist in a completely different world. "The primary requirement," he said, his voice taking on a subtle edge, "is maintaining appropriate distance. Physical contact is absolutely forbidden under all circumstances. This is non-negotiable." There was something in the way he said it that suggested this wasn't merely an eccentric preference, but something deeper and more complicated. Keisha's nursing instincts recognized the signs of someone who had been hurt in ways that left lasting damage. Whatever had happened to Park Jin-hwan had left him unable to tolerate human touch, isolated in his fortress of wealth and control. "I understand," she said, though she wasn't certain she understood anything about this strange, powerful man who was offering to transform her life while maintaining an invisible barrier between himself and the rest of the world. He studied her for a long moment, his sharp features revealing nothing of whatever evaluation was taking place behind his dark eyes. Then, with the same precision that seemed to characterize everything about him, he nodded once. "You begin Monday morning at 6 a.m., he said. "Your belongings will be moved this weekend. Welcome to my home, Miss Williams." As Keisha took the private elevator down from the penthouse, her mind reeled with the impossibility of what had just occurred. She had walked into the building as a struggling cleaning woman counting every dollar, and she was leaving as the highest-paid housekeeper in Seoul, working for a man who seemed to carry secrets as expensive as his suits. She thought of her grandmother's relief when the medical bills stopped coming, of her own exhaustion finally ending, of the nursing career that was suddenly within reach. But mostly, she thought about the careful way Park Jin-hwan had held himself, like a man who had learned that human touch brought nothing but pain, and wondered what terrible history had taught someone so powerful to live in such profound isolation. 3 weeks of living in Park Jin-hwan's penthouse had taught Keisha Williams that wealth and loneliness could occupy the same space with devastating efficiency. She had learned his patterns with the precision her nursing training demanded. He rose at 5:30, coffee black and consumed standing at the kitchen island while reviewing financial reports, never sitting where someone else might need to approach. He left at precisely 7:15, returned between 8 and 9 in the evening, and spent his nights in his study, surrounded by monitors and documents, maintaining his empire from behind barriers both physical and psychological. The penthouse operated like a carefully orchestrated machine designed to minimize human contact. Meals were delivered and left in designated areas. Correspondence arrived through electronic channels. Even his security team maintained their distance, communicating through earpieces and hand signals when he was present. Keisha had never seen anyone touch him, shake his hand, or even stand close enough to hand him an object directly. The expensive medical equipment she had glimpsed during her interview remained untouched in a room that felt more like a private hospital than part of a home. She had established her own routines around his invisible boundaries, learning to clean and maintain the vast space during his absence, to prepare meals that could be consumed without requiring service, to manage the household systems that kept his isolation comfortable and complete. The work was unlike anything she had ever experienced, less about traditional housekeeping and more about maintaining an environment where someone could exist without needing to rely on another human being's physical presence. But Keisha's nursing instincts recognized the signs that others might miss. The way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, suggesting an injury that hadn't healed properly. The prescription bottles barely visible in the bathroom medicine cabinet, painkillers that weren't being taken. The way he moved with careful precision that suggested he was managing discomfort he refused to acknowledge or treat. Park Jin-won was a man who had chosen to suffer alone rather than accept the vulnerability that came with being cared for. On Thursday morning, Keisha arrived at the penthouse earlier than usual, wanting to complete the weekly deep cleaning before her afternoon classes at Seoul National University. The scholarship and enrollment that Park Jin-won had arranged still felt surreal, like a dream she was afraid to examine too closely in case it disappeared. She used her key card to enter the private elevator, expecting to find the penthouse empty and silent as it always was during morning hours. Instead, she found the front door slightly ajar, which was impossible according to every protocol she had been taught. Park Jin-won never left doors open. He never left anything unsecured. His existence was built on control and containment, and an open door represented a crack in the armor that defined his world. Keisha felt her heart rate accelerate as her nursing training kicked in, recognizing that something was fundamentally wrong. She called his name softly as she entered, receiving no response from the vast space that suddenly felt ominous rather than merely empty. The living area appeared normal, furniture in perfect order, everything precisely as she had left it the previous evening. But there was something in the quality of the silence that felt different, heavier, like the moment before a medical emergency when experienced nurses could sense that catastrophe was imminent. The study door stood open, and through it Keisha could see Park Jin-won collapsed behind his massive desk, unconscious and utterly still. The sight hit her nervous system like electricity, every instinct screaming that this was exactly the kind of crisis her medical training had prepared her to handle. She moved toward him automatically, her mind cataloging details even as her hands reached for her phone to call emergency services. Blood had soaked through his expensive white shirt, spreading across his left side in a pattern that suggested a surgical wound had reopened catastrophically. His skin was pale with the grayish undertone that indicated significant blood loss, his breathing shallow and rapid in a way that meant his body was fighting to maintain circulation. This wasn't a minor injury that could wait for professional help. This was someone dying quietly and alone, too proud or too traumatized to ask for the assistance that might save his life. Keisha's finger hovered over the emergency number, then stopped. He had been explicit about never involving outside medical personnel. He had built his entire existence around avoiding exactly this kind of vulnerability, this kind of exposure. Calling an ambulance would save his life, but it would also violate the fundamental trust that had made their arrangement possible. She would be forcing him into the hands of strangers, into the kind of physical examination and treatment that his psychological barriers had been constructed to avoid. But she was a nursing student, and she could see that Park Jin-won was bleeding to death. Her medical training overrode every other consideration. Keisha dropped to her knees beside his chair, her hands moving to assess the wound, even as part of her mind screamed that she was violating the most important rule he had established. The blood was coming from his left side, soaking through multiple layers of fabric, suggesting that whatever surgical procedure had been performed recently had failed catastrophically. She pressed her hands against the wound, applying direct pressure to slow the bleeding, feeling his body beneath her palms for the first time. His skin was warm but growing cooler by the moment, his breathing becoming more labored as his body struggled to compensate for blood loss. Keisha found herself murmuring instructions to his unconscious form, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "Stay with me," she said, pressing harder against the wound, feeling the warm wetness of blood between her fingers. "You're not dying today. Not like this. Not alone. For several minutes." She maintained pressure while monitoring his vital signs, watching his color slowly improve as the bleeding slowed and his circulation stabilized. Her hands never left his body, her touch steady and professional despite the fact that she was violating every boundary he had established. This was what she had trained for, what her instincts demanded, what her conscience required regardless of the consequences. Park Jin-won's eyes opened slowly, confusion flickering across his sharp features as consciousness returned. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, uncertain of his surroundings or circumstances. Then his gaze focused on Keisha's face, moved down to her hands pressed against his side, and she saw the exact moment when he realized what had happened. His body went rigid with shock that had nothing to do with physical injury and everything to do with the fact that someone was touching him, caring for him, seeing him in a state of complete vulnerability. Keisha watched a series of emotions cross his face: alarm, confusion, something that might have been panic, and then, unexpectedly, a kind of wonder, as though he was experiencing something he had forgotten was possible. "You're bleeding," Keisha said, her voice calm and professional, making no move to remove her hands from the wound. The surgical site reopened. "You need medical attention." He stared at her for a long moment, his dark eyes holding an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Not anger, which she had expected. Not the fury of someone whose most fundamental boundary had been violated. Instead, there was something that looked almost like gratitude, complicated and raw and utterly unexpected. "You touched me," he said, the words barely above a whisper, as though he was stating a fact that defied comprehension. "You were dying," Keisha replied, meeting his gaze without apology or explanation. "I'm not sorry." Something shifted in his expression, a recognition that went beyond the immediate crisis and touched on something deeper and more complex. Park Jin-won had lived his adult life believing that human touch brought only pain and violation. But Keisha's hands on his body had brought healing instead of harm, comfort instead of trauma, care instead of cruelty. "I should fire you," he said, though there was no conviction in the statement. "You should thank me," Keisha replied, still maintaining pressure on his wound, still refusing to acknowledge that she had done anything except what the situation required. For the first time since she had known him, Park Jin-won smiled, a small, complicated expression that transformed his sharp features into something approaching warmth. It was the smile of a man who had just discovered that his most fundamental assumptions about the world might be wrong, and that perhaps, after years of isolation, healing was possible after all. The emergency medical kit that Park Jin-won kept in his study was sophisticated enough to stock a small clinic, filled with surgical supplies, antibiotics, and professional-grade wound care materials that suggested he had been managing serious injuries without professional help for some time. Keisha worked with careful efficiency, cleaning and redressing the surgical site that had reopened so catastrophically, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred between them. Park Jin-won sat perfectly still as she worked, his breathing controlled, but his entire body rigid with tension that had nothing to do with physical discomfort and everything to do with the fact that someone was touching him with gentle competence rather than violence or violation. Keisha could feel the way his muscles contracted beneath her fingers, could sense the internal battle between his psychological barriers and his body's desperate need for care. "This is temporary surgical mesh," she explained as she examined the wound, her voice professionally calm. "It's designed to reinforce internal repairs, but it can fail if there's too much stress on the site. You've been moving too much, working too hard, not allowing proper healing time." He watched her work with an expression that cycled between amazement and something that looked almost like hunger, as though he was experiencing a sensation he had forgotten existed. When her fingers brushed against unmarked skin while securing the new dressing, he flinched reflexively, but he didn't pull away or demand that she stop. "You have medical training," he said, the statement carrying the weight of recognition rather than question. "Nursing school," Keisha replied, taping the edges of the gauze with precise movements. 2 years completed, 1 year remaining. I've done clinical rotations in emergency and surgical units. I know what I'm doing." There was silence between them as she finished the wound care, both of them processing what had just occurred. Park Jin-won had allowed someone to touch him, to care for him, to see him in a state of complete vulnerability. Keisha had violated his most fundamental boundary and discovered that underneath his isolation was someone who needed healing in ways that went far beyond physical injury. When she finished and moved to clean up the medical supplies, Park Jin-hwan spoke again, his voice carrying a different quality than she had ever heard from him before. "I was 12 years old when they took me," he said, the words coming slowly, as though each one required careful consideration. "The Huang family wanted information about my father's shipping routes. They thought a child would break easily." Keisha continued organizing the medical kit, her movements careful and unhurried, recognizing that Park Jin-hwan was sharing something he had probably never told another person. She could feel the weight of his story settling into the space between them, heavy with implications she was only beginning to understand. "They kept me for 6 days," he continued, his dark eyes focused on something beyond the immediate room. "Every time they touched me, it was to cause pain, to break down my resistance, to teach me that human contact meant suffering. They were methodical about it, precise. They understood exactly how to use touch as a weapon." The clinical detachment in his voice told Keisha everything she needed to know about how he had survived that experience and how it had shaped everything that came after. Park Jin-hwan had learned to equate human touch with violence and violation, had built his entire adult existence around ensuring that no one could ever hurt him that way again. "When they realized I would never give them what they wanted, they became creative," he said, his voice never changing tone, as though he was reciting medical symptoms rather than describing trauma. "The scars are mostly internal now, invisible to casual observation. But my nervous system never forgot the lessons they taught me about what happens when someone gets close enough to touch." Keisha turned to face him fully, understanding now why the simple act of wound care had been so monumental, why his entire body had trembled beneath her hands not from pain, but from the violation of every defense mechanism that had kept him functioning for 2 decades. "I built this life to ensure that no one could ever touch me without my permission again," Park Jin-hwan continued. "I control every interaction, every physical space, every situation that might require proximity to another human being. It has been effective, but it has also been profoundly lonely." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that suggested he had never spoken these words aloud before. Keisha recognized the courage it took for someone like Park Jin-hwan to acknowledge vulnerability, to admit that his carefully constructed isolation came with a price that was becoming too expensive to pay. "But you touched me to save my life," he said, his sharp features softening slightly. "And instead of panic or pain, I felt something I had forgotten was possible. I felt cared for." The conversation shifted then, becoming something more formal and businesslike, though the emotional foundation they had just established colored everything that followed. Park Jin-hwan moved to his desk, extracting a leather portfolio that contained documents he had clearly prepared in advance. "I want to modify our arrangement," he said, his voice returning to the controlled precision she had come to associate with his business persona. "Your current position as household manager is insufficient for what I actually need from you." Keisha felt her heart rate increase as he outlined the proposal with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to everything else. The position would be personal medical caretaker, Livian, and available 24 hours daily. The salary would be $150,000 annually, plus comprehensive benefits, plus her grandmother's complete medical expenses covered through a private health plan that would ensure she received the best possible care. Your nursing education would be completed through Seoul National University's accelerated program, with all expenses paid and flexible scheduling to accommodate your availability requirements, Park Jin-hwan continued. Upon completion, you would have the option to continue in this capacity or transition to a position in one of my legitimate healthcare investments. The scope of what he was offering was breathtaking, financial security beyond anything Keisha had ever imagined, but the implications were equally significant. This wasn't just a job, it was a complete transformation of her life, a binding commitment to someone whose world she was only beginning to understand. "What exactly would my responsibilities include?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be more complicated than traditional medical care. "You would be available to provide medical attention whenever needed," he said, his eyes meeting hers directly. "You would maintain complete discretion about my health conditions and any treatment you provide. You would ask no questions about my business activities or the circumstances that might require your medical intervention. The carefully neutral language couldn't disguise what he was really asking. Park Jin-won was offering her extraordinary compensation in exchange for becoming his personal trauma specialist, someone who could provide medical care without judgment or questions, someone who could touch him when his psychological barriers made professional medical treatment impossible. This isn't real nursing, Keisha said, recognizing the ethical complexities of what he was proposing. This is enabling your isolation instead of helping you heal from it. I have ambitions beyond being someone's private medical staff. Park Jin-won listened to her objections without interruption, his expression remaining carefully neutral. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and regarded her with the same intense focus he brought to evaluating business propositions. Your grandmother's dialysis treatments cost approximately $8,000 monthly, he said, his voice matter-of-fact but not unkind. Your student loans total $52,000. Your current income from 3 jobs barely covers basic living expenses. You are working yourself toward exhaustion while your grandmother's condition deteriorates and your education remains incomplete. Each statement was accurate and devastating, a precise catalog of the financial realities that constrained every aspect of Keisha's life. She felt the weight of those numbers settling around her like chains, the mathematical proof that despite her determination and hard work, she was fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. I am offering you immediate financial security, the completion of your education, and the guarantee that your grandmother will receive the best medical care available, Park Jin-won continued. In exchange, you would provide medical services to someone who cannot access traditional health care due to circumstances beyond his control. The logic was irrefutable, even as the emotional implications remained complicated. Keisha stared at the documents spread across his desk, seeing her future laid out in legal language and financial projections. She could continue struggling alone, watching her grandmother's health decline while her own dreams remained perpetually deferred. Or she could accept this strange, generous offer from a man who needed healing as desperately as she needed security. There's something else, Park Jin-won said, his voice taking on a different quality. I need you to understand what accepting this position means. You would be the only person with regular physical access to me. That makes you valuable to my enemies and dangerous to yourself. This arrangement comes with risks that extend far beyond the medical care you would provide. The warning was delivered with the same clinical precision as everything else, but Keisha could hear the genuine concern beneath his controlled tone. Park Jin-won was offering her everything she needed to transform her life, but he was also acknowledging that stepping into his world would expose her to dangers she couldn't fully comprehend. I need to know that you can handle the medical requirements, he said, reaching for the fresh bandages she had just applied. Will you check the dressing, make sure everything is properly secured? It was a test, Keisha realized, an opportunity for him to evaluate whether he could tolerate regular medical care and for her to decide whether she could provide it. She moved toward him slowly, giving him time to change his mind, watching for any signs of the panic response he had described. Park Jin-won's breathing became carefully controlled as her hands approached his body, his entire frame tense with anticipation. But when her fingers touched the edge of the bandaging, checking for proper adhesion and signs of bleeding, he remained perfectly still, allowing her to provide the care he needed despite the obvious effort it required. The dressing looks good, Keisha said, her hands moving with gentle efficiency. No signs of renewed bleeding. You should have this checked again in 12 hours, earlier if you experience any unusual symptoms. When she finished and stepped back, Park Jin-won looked at her with an expression that contained gratitude, relief, and something that might have been hope. For the first time in 20 years, he had allowed someone to touch him without experiencing trauma. For the first time in her adult life, Keisha had found someone willing to pay her what she was worth. I accept your offer, she said, the decision feeling both inevitable and transformative. But I have conditions of my own. Park Jin-won smiled, the expression transforming his sharp features into something approaching warmth. In that moment, Keisha realized that she wasn't just accepting a job offer. She was agreeing to become the bridge between a wounded man and the healing he had convinced himself was impossible. She was choosing to enter a world of wealth and danger where her most valuable skill, would be her ability to offer gentle touch to someone who had learned to equate human contact with pain. As she signed the documents that would reshape her entire existence, Keisha wondered if Park Jin-hwan understood that he wasn't just hiring a medical caretaker. He was hiring someone who might finally teach him the difference between touch that hurt and touch that healed. 2 months of living as Park Jin-hwan's personal medical caretaker had taught Keisha Williams that healing could happen in increments so small they were almost invisible until she looked back and realized how far they had traveled together. The guest suite she now occupied was larger than her previous apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered the same spectacular city view as the main living areas. But what surprised her most was how quickly the vast penthouse had begun to feel like home rather than a workplace. Their morning routine had evolved into something that resembled normalcy despite its unique constraints. Park Jin-hwan still maintained careful distance during their interactions, but the rigid tension that had characterized their early encounters had softened into something more manageable. When she checked his vital signs each morning, taking his blood pressure and monitoring the surgical site for signs of infection or reopening, his body no longer went rigid with panic at her approach. The simple act of allowing her to place a stethoscope against his chest had taken 3 weeks to accomplish without triggering his trauma responses. Keisha had approached it with the patience her nursing training had taught her, explaining each step before proceeding, giving him control over the pace and duration of each contact. The first time she had been able to complete a full cardiac assessment without him pulling away, Park Jin-hwan had looked at her with an expression of wonder, as though she had accomplished something miraculous rather than merely routine medical care. Their meals had transitioned from awkward affairs conducted across the vast dining room to something approaching companionship. Park Jin-hwan still maintained his preference for distance, but he had begun to time his eating to coincide with hers, and their conversations during these shared moments had grown beyond the strictly professional into something more personal and complex. He asked about her grandmother with genuine interest, listening carefully as Keisha described the improvement in her condition since beginning treatment at the private medical facility he had arranged. He inquired about her progress in the accelerated nursing program, demonstrating a detailed understanding of medical education that suggested he had researched the field thoroughly to ensure she was receiving the best possible training. When Keisha's grandmother visited the penthouse for Sunday dinner, Park Jin-hwan's behavior revealed layers of his personality that his business persona had kept hidden. He was awkward but sincere in his attempts to make the elderly woman comfortable, ensuring that her wheelchair could navigate the space easily, arranging for specialized medical equipment to be temporarily installed so she could extend her visit without missing her dialysis schedule. Mrs. Williams had studied Park Jin-hwan with the shrewd assessment of someone who had survived 8 decades by understanding people's true nature beneath their surface presentations. After he had excused himself to allow them privacy for their visit, she had turned to Keisha with a knowing expression. "That man carries old wounds," she had said, her voice gentle but perceptive. "But he looks at you like you might be the medicine he's been needing. Be careful, granddaughter. Healing someone can be as dangerous as loving them." The observation had stayed with Keisha through the weeks that followed, coloring her awareness of the subtle changes in Park Jin-hwan's behavior toward her. She had begun to notice the way his dark eyes tracked her movements when she worked around the penthouse, not with suspicion or surveillance, but with something that looked almost like appreciation. He had started requesting her presence during his late-night work sessions, claiming he needed medical supervision due to his tendency to work through fatigue. But Keisha suspected he simply wanted company during the hours when his insomnia made sleep impossible. The breakthrough came during a business meeting that Keisha was not supposed to witness. She had been in the kitchen preparing Park Jin-hwan's evening medications when she heard voices from his study become elevated, then suddenly urgent. Through the partially open door, she could see him meeting with 2 men in expensive suits, their conversation conducted in rapid Korean that her basic language skills couldn't follow completely. Whatever they were discussing had triggered something in Park Jin-hwan's nervous system that his usual control mechanisms couldn't manage. Keisha watched his breathing become shallow and rapid, saw his hands begin to tremble in a way that indicated he was experiencing a full panic response. His associates seemed oblivious to his distress, continuing their animated discussion while he fought to maintain his composed exterior. Without conscious decision, Keisha moved through the study door and approached his desk, her presence immediately drawing the attention of the two men. They looked at her with surprise and obvious disapproval, clearly unused to being interrupted during business meetings. "Mr. Park needs to check his blood pressure," she said, her voice professionally calm and authoritative. "His medication schedule requires monitoring at this time." It was a complete fabrication, but delivered with enough medical authority that the men accepted it without question. Park Jin-won's eyes met hers, and she could see the gratitude behind his careful expression. He excused the meeting, asking his associates to continue their discussion the following day. When they were alone, Keisha moved to his side without hesitation, placing her hand lightly on his shoulder in a gesture that had become natural between them over the weeks of medical care. The moment her palm made contact with his body, she felt the tension in his muscles begin to ease, his breathing slowly returning to normal patterns. "What happened?" she asked, her voice gentle but concerned. They were discussing territorial disputes, expansion into markets that belonged to families who knew me as a child, Park Jin-won said, his voice still carrying traces of the emotional storm he had just weathered. "Sometimes the past returns without warning, and my body remembers fear before my mind can process that the danger is no longer immediate." Keisha kept her hand on his shoulder, feeling the way his nervous system continued to settle under her touch. Over the weeks of providing his medical care, she had learned to read the subtle signs of his trauma responses, had developed techniques for helping him navigate the psychological barriers that still interfered with his healing. "Your heart rate is elevated," she said, reaching for the blood pressure cuff that she kept readily available. "Let me get an actual reading to make sure you're physiologically stable." The routine of medical assessment had become a grounding technique for both of them, a way for Park Jin-won to reconnect with his body after emotional overwhelm and a way for Keisha to provide care that went beyond purely physical healing. As she wrapped the cuff around his arm and listened to his pulse through the stethoscope, she realized that their relationship had evolved far beyond the professional arrangement they had initially negotiated. These evening sessions had become the foundation of an intimacy neither of them had anticipated. Park Jin-won would share details about his business operations, explaining the complex networks of legitimate and illegitimate enterprises that comprised his empire. Keisha would tell him about her dreams of working in trauma medicine, her desire to help people who had survived experiences similar to his own. During one late-night conversation, as she helped him apply therapeutic heat to old injury sites that caused chronic pain, Park Jin-won had looked at her with an expression of curiosity and something deeper. "Why did you choose nursing?" he asked. "With your intelligence and determination, you could have pursued any number of careers that would have been less physically and emotionally demanding." Keisha considered the question as she adjusted the heating pad positioning, her hands moving with practiced efficiency across his scarred back. The answer was more personal than she usually shared, but the intimacy of their current situation seemed to invite honesty. "I grew up watching my grandmother manage my grandfather's diabetes, his heart condition, all the ways his body was failing him while they couldn't afford proper medical care," she said. "I learned that healing happens through touch, through presence, through someone caring enough to pay attention to what your body needs. I wanted to be that person for people who didn't have anyone else." Park Jin-won was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words while she worked to ease the chronic tension that years of hypervigilance had built into his muscles. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality than she had heard before. "You are that person for me," he said. "I had convinced myself that I didn't need healing, that I could function indefinitely on control and isolation. But these weeks with you have shown me the difference between surviving and actually living." The admission hung between them, weighted with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Keisha continued her careful ministrations, feeling the way his body had learned to accept her touch not just as medical necessity, but as comfort, as connection, as the kind of gentle human contact he had spent decades believing was impossible. As she worked, Keisha found herself studying the scars that mapped the trauma history across his skin, understanding now that each mark represented a lesson in pain that had shaped his entire adult existence. But under her hands, those same scars were becoming something different, evidence of survival rather than destruction, proof that healing was possible even after the most devastating damage. What surprised her most was her own emotional response to this gradual transformation. Park Jin-won was no longer just the isolated, powerful man who had offered her financial security in exchange for medical services. He had become someone she genuinely cared about, someone whose healing mattered to her beyond professional obligation. She found herself thinking about him during her university classes, planning ways to help him navigate the psychological barriers that still limited his ability to accept care. The realization that she was falling in love with him came slowly, built from hundreds of small moments of trust and connection rather than any single dramatic revelation. She was in love with his careful intelligence, the way he approached every problem with methodical precision. She was in love with his unexpected gentleness, the way he had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure her grandmother received the best possible care. Most of all, she was in love with his courage in allowing her to help him heal, despite the vulnerability it required. Park Jin-won seemed to be experiencing his own emotional evolution. Keisha had begun to notice the way his attention lingered on her face during their conversations, the way he found reasons to extend their evening medical sessions beyond what was strictly necessary. He had started asking about her daily activities with an interest that went beyond polite inquiry, and his protective instincts had become increasingly evident. When her university professors had assigned a clinical rotation that required late-night shifts at Seoul General Hospital, Park Jin-won had quietly arranged for private security to ensure her safety during the commute. When she mentioned concerns about her old neighborhood becoming unsafe, he had investigators gathering information within hours. His care for her welfare had expanded far beyond their formal arrangement into something that resembled genuine devotion. But it was the small moments of domestic intimacy that revealed how fundamentally their relationship had changed. The way he had learned to accept her casual touches during medication administration, the way they had developed wordless communication during his medical care, the way he had begun seeking her opinion on business decisions, valuing her perspective despite her lack of experience in his world. One evening, as Keisha finished checking the surgical site that had brought them together, Park Jin-won caught her hand gently, preventing her from moving away immediately. "These weeks with you have been the first time in 20 years that I have looked forward to someone's company," he said, his voice carrying the careful control that characterized his most honest moments. "I want you to know that whatever our arrangement was initially, it has become something more important to me than mere medical care." Keisha felt her heart rate accelerate as she met his dark eyes, seeing in them an emotional vulnerability that he rarely allowed himself to express. The space between them seemed charged with possibility and complication in equal measure. Before she could respond, his secure phone buzzed with an alert that immediately transformed his expression from tender to alert. He released her hand to check the message, his features hardening as he processed whatever information he was receiving. "What is it?" Keisha asked, recognizing the signs that his business world was intruding on their private moment. "My security team has identified surveillance equipment in the building across the street," Park Jin-won said, his voice returning to the cold precision she associated with his most dangerous moods. "Someone has been watching this penthouse, specifically monitoring the patterns of anyone who visits regularly. They know about you, Keisha. They know that you matter to me." The implications of his words settled between them like a shadow, reminding Keisha that falling in love with Park Jin-won meant accepting the dangers that came with his world. Someone had noticed that the untouchable crime boss had developed a weakness, and that weakness had a name and a face that could be targeted. As she looked into his eyes and saw the protective fury building there, Keisha realized that their careful journey toward healing was about to become something much more dangerous and complex. The surveillance equipment discovered across from Park Jin-won's penthouse was sophisticated, military-grade technology that indicated serious professional interest rather than casual criminal opportunism. Within hours of its detection, his security team had compiled a comprehensive threat assessment that painted a disturbing picture of coordinated intelligence gathering focused specifically on identifying his vulnerabilities. The Kwan family had been watching for 3 weeks, documenting every person who entered or left the building, mapping the patterns of daily life that revealed who mattered enough to warrant regular access to the untouchable crime boss. They had photographs of Keisha arriving for her university classes, detailed schedules of her grandmother's medical appointments, and behavioral analysis suggesting that Park Jin-won's legendary emotional detachment had developed a significant and exploitable weakness. Park Jin-won reviewed the intelligence reports with the cold focus he brought to evaluating threats against his empire, but Keisha could see the tension building in his shoulders as he processed the implications. The careful isolation that had protected him for 20 years had been compromised by his decision to allow someone close enough to matter, and now that someone was in danger because of his past inability to maintain the barriers that had kept him safe. "This is exactly what I spent 2 decades avoiding," he said, his voice carrying the controlled fury that indicated he was fighting against emotional responses that threatened his strategic thinking. "The moment you care about someone, they become a weapon that can be used against you." The Kwans understand this perfectly. Keisha studied the surveillance photographs spread across his desk, seeing herself captured in mundane moments that now felt ominous and invasive. Walking to her university classes, visiting her grandmother at the medical facility, shopping for groceries in the neighborhood market she had always considered safe. Every aspect of her routine had been cataloged and analyzed by people who understood exactly how to use her life as leverage against Park Jin-won. "You're overreacting," she said, though she could feel her own anxiety building as she absorbed the scope of the intelligence gathering. "These are just photographs. People take pictures all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean anyone wants to hurt me." Park Jin-won looked at her with an expression that mixed exasperation with genuine fear, emotions she had never seen him display simultaneously. His experience in the criminal world had taught him to recognize threats that someone like Keisha, despite her intelligence and strength, simply couldn't comprehend without living in that environment. The Kwan family operates protection rackets, human trafficking, and contract elimination services throughout Southeast Asia, he explained, his voice taking on the educational tone he used when describing complex business concepts. "They do not gather intelligence for academic interest. They are mapping your life because they intend to take you and use you to control me." Despite his warnings, Keisha maintained her belief that his concerns were excessive, that his trauma history was making him interpret ordinary surveillance as extraordinary threat. She continued her normal routines, attending her university classes and visiting her grandmother at the medical facility, taking basic precautions but refusing to live in the kind of fear that would transform her existence into the same isolated imprisonment that had defined Park Jin-won's adult life. The first direct contact came through her grandmother's dialysis center, a phone call that seemed routine until the caller began describing details about Keisha's daily schedule that no legitimate medical professional should have possessed. The voice was polite, professional, but contained subtle threats wrapped in language that could be interpreted as concern for family safety. "Miss Williams, we understand that your granddaughter has been working in a challenging environment," the caller said to the elderly woman. "We want to ensure that she understands the importance of making wise choices about her employment relationships. Some positions come with risks that extend beyond the employee to their loved ones." When Keisha's grandmother reported the conversation, describing her confusion about how strangers knew so much about their family circumstances, Keisha finally began to understand that Park Jin-won's warnings were not paranoid overreaction, but accurate threat assessment from someone with experience in a world she had never imagined. But her recognition of the danger came too late to prevent escalation. The attempted kidnapping occurred during her grandmother's regular Wednesday dialysis appointment, in the hospital parking structure that Keisha had used dozens of times without incident. 3 men in a van had been waiting, positioned to intercept her route between the parking elevator and the medical facility entrance. Their approach was professional, coordinated, designed to complete the abduction quickly and quietly without attracting attention from hospital security. Keisha had noticed them because their positioning felt wrong, blocking natural pedestrian flow in a way that triggered her nursing instincts about potential medical emergencies. When they moved toward her with purpose rather than moving around her, she understood immediately that she was their specific target rather than a random crime victim. The self-defense training that Park Jin-won had quietly arranged for her proved invaluable in those crucial seconds. Instead of freezing or attempting to negotiate, Keisha ran toward the hospital entrance, screaming for security while using parked cars as barriers between herself and her pursuers. The public nature of the location and her immediate loud resistance forced the men to abandon their attempt, but not before she had seen enough of their faces and heard enough of their conversation to understand that this was not a random attack. When hospital security reviewed the surveillance footage, they found evidence of professional surveillance equipment that had been monitoring the medical facility for weeks, specifically tracking the schedule of dialysis patients and their family members. The attempted abduction had been planned with detailed knowledge of Keisha's routine, suggesting that the Kwan family's intelligence gathering had been far more comprehensive than anyone had realized. Park Jin-won's response to news of the attack was unlike anything Keisha had witnessed from him. The controlled intensity that characterized his normal demeanor transformed into something cold and deadly, a focused fury that made her understand why people feared him despite never seeing him commit violence directly. This was the man who had built and maintained a criminal empire through strategic application of force, and she had just become the target that activated every protective instinct his dangerous world had developed. "I warned you that caring about someone would make them a target," he said, his voice carrying a quality that suggested he was fighting against responses that went beyond mere anger into something more primitive and destructive. "I should have forced you to accept protection instead of hoping that minimal precautions would be sufficient." But even as he mobilized his security resources and developed response strategies, Park Jin-won's greatest fear was being realized. The final attack came not against Keisha in a public location where she might escape or find help, but against the penthouse itself, designed to capture her in the one place where both she and Park Jin-won had believed they were completely safe. The home invasion was executed with military precision during the narrow window when Park Jin-won was attending a mandatory meeting with law enforcement officials, an appointment that the Kwan family had somehow learned about and planned around. 5 men bypassed the building's sophisticated security systems and gained access to the penthouse through service corridors that should have been impossible to penetrate. Keisha was in the study, reviewing medical journals for her university coursework, when she heard sounds that didn't belong to the normal rhythm of the building. Footsteps in the hallway outside the penthouse door, voices speaking in low Korean that carried the tactical precision of people conducting a military operation. She recognized immediately that this was the escalation Park Jin-won had predicted, the moment when surveillance and threats transformed into direct action. Her first call was to Park Jin-won's emergency line, a direct connection that would alert him regardless of his location or circumstances. Her voice was steady despite her terror as she reported the situation, following the protocols he had taught her for exactly this scenario. "They're inside the building," she said, her whisper barely audible as she heard the penthouse door being breached. 5 men, professional equipment, they know the layout. "I'm in the study, but they'll find me in minutes." Park Jin-won's response was immediate and decisive, his voice carrying the deadly calm that indicated he had shifted completely into combat mode. He was 20 minutes away in traffic, but his security team was already mobilizing, converging on the building from multiple directions while he coordinated their response from his moving vehicle. "Lock the study door and move to the safe room behind the bookshelf," he instructed, his voice steady despite what she could hear was the sound of him moving at high speed. "Do not engage them under any circumstances. I am coming for you." But 20 minutes was longer than the safe room could protect her against professional operators who had planned their assault with detailed knowledge of the penthouse's security features. The men who breached the study door were not common criminals, but military-trained specialists who understood exactly how to neutralize resistance and extract their target efficiently. When they found her, their leader spoke in accented English that confirmed these were Kwan family operatives conducting a sanctioned kidnapping rather than freelance criminals seeking ransom money. "Miss Williams, we have no intention of harming you if you cooperate fully," he said, his tone politely professional despite the circumstances. "You represent significant value to someone who has caused problems for our organization. Your safety depends entirely on his willingness to negotiate reasonably for your return." The next few hours passed in a blur of transportation and confinement that confirmed Park Jin-won's warnings about the ruthless efficiency of professional criminal organizations. Keisha found herself in a warehouse facility outside Seoul, secured but not physically harmed, while her captors initiated contact with Park Jin-won to begin negotiations for her release. What they had not anticipated was that Park Jin-won would respond to Keisha's kidnapping not as a business negotiation, but as a declaration of war against everything he had built to protect. Instead of engaging in the careful diplomatic process that typically governed disputes between criminal families, he mobilized every resource at his disposal for immediate and overwhelming retaliation. The rescue operation was swift, brutal, and completely effective. Park Jin-won arrived at the warehouse facility with a force that included not only his own security personnel, but contracted specialists whose expertise in close-quarters combat eliminated the Quan operatives with surgical precision. Keisha was extracted unharmed, but the price of her safety was measured in violence that demonstrated exactly why Park Jin-won's reputation for controlled lethality was so carefully maintained throughout the criminal world. In the aftermath, as Keisha sat in the back of an armored vehicle while Park Jin-won coordinated the cleanup of what had essentially been a small military engagement, she finally understood the full scope of the world she had entered by caring about him. The gentle, careful man who had learned to accept her healing touch was also someone capable of orchestrating violence on a scale that eliminated threats permanently and comprehensively. The Quan family's leadership was removed that same night, their operations dismantled through coordinated strikes that occurred simultaneously across 3 countries. It was a demonstration of power and resources that ensured no other organization would consider targeting Park Jin-won through the people he cared about. But it was also a revelation of capabilities that changed how Keisha understood the man she had fallen in love with. When they returned to the penthouse, Park Jin-won dismissed his security team and stood alone with Keisha in the space where their careful intimacy had developed over months of gradual healing. The silence between them was weighted with everything that had just occurred, the violence that had been necessary to secure her safety, and the questions it raised about what it meant to love someone whose protection came at such a cost. "I need you to understand what just happened," Park Jin-won said, his voice carrying exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue into something that touched the core of who he was. "I eliminated an entire criminal organization tonight because they threatened you. I committed acts of violence that will reshape the balance of power throughout the region because someone tried to use you against me." Keisha looked at him, seeing the man who had learned to accept gentle touch and finding that knowledge intact despite everything she now knew about his capacity for devastation. The contradiction was not a flaw in her understanding, but the complete truth about who Park Jin-won was. Someone whose gentleness and violence existed in the same person, shaped by experiences that had taught him that sometimes love required the willingness to become a monster. "I can't go back to isolation," he continued, his careful control finally cracking to reveal the vulnerability beneath his deadly capabilities. "You have healed something in me that I didn't know was broken. But I also can't guarantee that caring about you won't put you in danger again. This is the choice I never wanted to force on anyone, accepting that my love comes with risks that most people should never have to face." The choice was as clear as it was impossible. Keisha could walk away from Park Jin-won, returning to her previous life of struggle and limitation, but also safety and simplicity. Or she could choose to stay with a man whose love was genuine, but whose world was built on foundations of violence that would always pose threats to anyone who mattered to him. As she looked into his dark eyes and saw the desperate hope he was trying to hide, Keisha realized that her choice had been made months ago, in the moment when she had first touched his wounded body and felt him begin to heal under her hands. The days following the elimination of the Quan family passed in a strange suspension of normal time, as though the violence that had secured Keisha's safety had created a space outside ordinary reality where she and Park Jin-won could finally address what their relationship had become. The penthouse felt different now, charged with the knowledge that he had been willing to reshape the criminal landscape of an entire region rather than lose her, that her safety had become more important to him than the careful diplomatic balance he had maintained for decades. Keisha found herself studying Park Jin-won with new awareness, seeing both the gentle man who accepted her medical care and the strategist who had coordinated military-level operations to protect her. The contradiction was not disturbing but complete, the full truth about someone whose capacity for violence existed in service of his capacity for love. She understood now that his darkness was not separate from his gentleness, but the foundation that made his vulnerability possible. He had not touched her since the rescue, maintaining a careful distance that felt different from his previous psychological barriers. This was not the automatic recoil of someone traumatized by human contact, but the conscious restraint of someone who was afraid that what he had done to save her might have changed how she saw him. Park Jin-won was waiting for her to decide whether the man who had killed to protect her was still someone she could love. The answer came during a moment that began with routine medical care and transformed into something that completed the healing they had been working toward for months. Keisha had noticed that Park Jin-won was favoring his left shoulder again, stress and physical exertion during the rescue operation having aggravated old injury sites that required attention. When she approached him with the heating pad and therapeutic supplies they had used so many times before, he looked at her with an expression that contained both need and uncertainty. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability that his public persona would never reveal. "After everything you have seen, everything you know about what I am capable of, are you certain you want to continue caring for me?" Keisha moved behind his chair without hesitation, her hands beginning the familiar process of treating the chronic tension that years of hypervigilance had built into his muscles. But this time, instead of the careful professional distance she had maintained even during their most intimate medical interactions, she allowed her touch to carry the emotional weight of everything they had experienced together. "You saved my life," she said, her voice soft but certain as she worked to ease the knots of stress and old trauma from his shoulders. "You risked everything you built to bring me home safely. I have never been more certain of who you are or what you mean to me." Park Jin-won's response was immediate and overwhelming. 20 years of emotional control cracked completely, and for the first time since his childhood trauma, he broke down with the kind of desperate crying that came from finally allowing himself to feel everything he had suppressed in order to survive. His body shook with the force of grief and relief combined, processing not only the terror of nearly losing Keisha, but the recognition that someone had finally chosen to stay with him despite knowing the full truth about his world. Keisha wrapped her arms around him from behind, holding him while he experienced the emotional release that represented the end of his isolation. Her touch was no longer careful medical contact, but the complete emotional intimacy of someone offering comfort to the person she loved most in the world. For the first time, Park Jin-won allowed himself to be completely vulnerable in another person's arms, trusting that Keisha would hold his broken pieces without trying to fix them or judge them. "I thought I had learned to live without needing anyone," he said when he could speak again, his voice raw from crying but steady with certainty. "But these months with you have shown me that I wasn't living at all, just surviving. You have given me a reason to want more than mere existence." The shift between them was complete and irreversible. Park Jin-won turned in his chair to face Keisha directly, his dark eyes holding an intensity that had nothing to do with business calculations and everything to do with emotional truth. When he reached for her hands, his touch was confident rather than hesitant, claiming rather than requesting. "You are mine," he said, the words carrying the weight of possession and devotion combined. "Not as an employee or a caretaker, but as the person who holds my heart and my future. I can't survive without your touch again. I don't want to try." Keisha felt her own emotional barriers dissolving as she met his gaze, seeing in his expression the complete commitment that his actions had already demonstrated. This was not the careful negotiation of terms that had characterized their professional arrangement, but the absolute claiming that came with recognizing that some connections could not be managed or controlled, only accepted completely. "And you are mine," she replied, her voice carrying the same certainty that had guided her through every choice since the moment she had decided to save his life rather than follow his rules. "Broken pieces and all, dark history and dangerous future. I choose all of it because I choose you." The kiss that followed was the first physical intimacy between them that was not related to medical care, the moment when touch became about love rather than healing. But even as their relationship transformed into something beyond their original arrangement, Keisha realized that the healing had been mutual and complete. Park Jin-won had learned to accept gentle touch, but she had learned that her capacity for caring was worth more than she had ever imagined. Their commitment was formalized not through traditional romantic gestures, but through the kind of practical planning that reflected the serious nature of their shared future. Park Jin-won proposed marriage with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to business acquisitions, presenting her with legal documents that would make her a full partner in his legitimate enterprises and a protected member of his organization. The marriage contract included provisions that addressed every aspect of their complicated circumstances. Keisha would complete her medical education with full financial support, then establish a trauma healing center that would provide care for people who had survived experiences similar to Park Jin-won's. Her grandmother would receive comprehensive medical care for the remainder of her life, with a dedicated team of specialists ensuring that her dialysis and related treatments were managed with luxury-level attention. But beyond the financial security, Park Jin-won offered something more valuable: true partnership in reshaping parts of his empire toward legitimate purposes. Together, they would develop healthcare facilities that could serve both his organization's needs and provide genuine medical services to communities that lacked access to quality care. Keisha's medical expertise would guide investments in trauma treatment programs, while Park Jin-won's resources would ensure they had the funding to make real impact. The transformation extended beyond their personal relationship into every aspect of how Park Jin-won conducted his business operations. The isolation that had characterized his leadership style gave way to something more collaborative, though no less effective. Keisha became his trusted advisor on matters that required understanding human psychology and motivation, while he provided her with resources to pursue medical innovation on a scale that individual practitioners could never achieve. Their wedding was a small, private ceremony conducted in the penthouse that had become their shared home, with only Keisha's grandmother and Park Jin-won's most trusted security chief as witnesses. The vows they exchanged acknowledged the unusual nature of their partnership, promising not only love and loyalty, but also the courage to continue healing each other despite the challenges that would always exist in their complicated world. The hospital wing that opened 6 months after their marriage bore both their names, a state-of-the-art trauma treatment facility that specialized in helping survivors of violence and abuse develop healthy relationships with human touch and medical care. Park Jin-won's financial support made advanced treatment available to patients regardless of their ability to pay, while Keisha's direct involvement ensured that the medical protocols addressed both physical and psychological aspects of healing. Working together in the trauma center, Keisha and Park Jin-won discovered that their individual healing had prepared them to help others navigate similar journeys. Park Jin-won's presence reassured male patients that recovery from severe trauma was possible, while his obvious devotion to Keisha demonstrated that intimate relationships could exist without exploitation or harm. Keisha's medical expertise, combined with her personal understanding of caring for someone with touch-related trauma, made her exceptionally effective at developing treatment plans that respected patients' psychological barriers while promoting genuine healing. The penthouse itself had been transformed from a monument to isolation into a warm, welcoming space where touch and connection were celebrated rather than feared. The medical equipment that had once represented Park Jin-won's determination to manage his health without human assistance now served as tools for their shared work in helping other trauma survivors. The silence that had once defined his existence was replaced by conversation, laughter, and the comfortable sounds of two people building a life together. On their first anniversary, as Keisha checked Park Jin-won's blood pressure during their evening routine that had evolved from medical necessity into intimate ritual, she reflected on how completely their lives had changed since the morning she had found him unconscious and bleeding in his study. He no longer flinched when she touched him, no longer maintained careful distance during their interactions. Instead, he actively sought her physical presence, finding comfort and grounding in contact that had once triggered panic responses. "Your heart rate is perfect," she said, removing the blood pressure cuff and noting the reading in his medical chart that she still maintained out of professional habit. "That is because you taught me that my heart was safe with you," Park Jin-won replied, pulling her onto his lap in a gesture that would have been impossible during the early weeks of their relationship. "You saved my life in every way that matters." Looking around their home, filled with warmth and connection and the evidence of two lives fully intertwined. Keisha marveled at the journey that had brought them from desperate necessity to profound love. She had entered Park Jinwon's world as a struggling nursing student with impossible financial pressures and a grandmother whose medical needs seemed beyond her capacity to meet. She had become a respected medical professional, a beloved partner, and someone whose touch had literally saved a man who had convinced himself that healing was impossible. Park Jinwon had evolved from an isolated crime boss who managed his empire from behind barriers of wealth and fear into someone capable of vulnerability, partnership, and the kind of love that transformed everything it touched. His organization now included legitimate healthcare enterprises alongside its traditional operations, providing cover for both his criminal activities and genuine medical services that improved countless lives. Together, they had built something that transcended the simple arrangement they had originally negotiated. They had created a partnership that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment to healing, both for themselves and for others who needed to learn that touch could bring comfort rather than harm. In the quiet evening light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Seoul, Keisha Williams and Park Jinwon sat together in comfortable silence, two people whose separate traumas had been transformed through love into a strength that neither could have achieved alone. The untouchable crime boss had learned to accept gentle care, and the overwhelmed nursing student had discovered that her capacity for healing was worth more than she had ever dared to dream.